Good afternoon and welcome again to this afternoon's presentation, Botanical Science for Beginners. Thanks for joining us early. We've watched you all kind of come in the door here and there, and thank you for taking some time to sit down with us on an afternoon. We can all feel that the weather is getting nicer, and all the more reason to go outside and study plants. We have a little bit more inspiration to spend some time outside looking closely at things. So thank you for giving up part of this afternoon to join us here for Botanical Science for Beginners. I'm James Stevenson. I'm with the University of Florida, IFAS, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. We serve our community, Pinellas County, as a resource for research-based information on particular topics of interest and of necessity. So you can come to us for free information, non-biased, tested, researched, all these great things. We're a local resource just for you. And today our foray will be botany. Now we're a small but powerful crowd today, and therefore I'm going to go ahead and encourage you now as we go, please use the Q&A to submit any questions you might have, or any complaints, or any contradictions, or anything you'd like. I should be able to get to all the Q&As as we go. So we'll cover a lot of territory, but we'll do this at your pace. Studying botany, or just bringing up the subject of botany, might be a bit intimidating. It is, of course, one of the sciences, one of the biological sciences, a course of study. It's possible that people might have had a bad experience studying botany at university or even in high school. Once you get into the terrifyingly complex process of photosynthesis and the chemical reactions and the electron transfers and all those things, can turn people off. And we even have changed the name of this presentation to include the words for beginners. Our first outing of this presentation was just called Botanical Science, or Botany 101. And we wouldn't get anyone to sign up. And it's probably because there's this fear factor. Look at what the Oxford Dictionary of Biology has to say about what botany is. It's all these scary words: anatomy, morphology, physiology, biochemistry, taxonomy, cytology, all these. It's okay, because today, let's redefine that botany a little bit. Let's take a breath and look at some really cool things about plants. They're all around us. They're easy to study because they don't run away. They can be very fascinating. The plant world is an endless encyclopedia of fantastic things, and our lives are intrinsically woven into the botanical world that surrounds us. So let's take a step back and see what the plant world has to offer to us. Now, again, there's around 400,000 different plants writ large. Plants writ large. There's 400,000 different ones. And a humongous variety. So how on earth, if you're interested in studying plants, how in the world do you start with all that diversity, with all that variety? How am I ever going to make sense of an individual plant and learn anything at all about it? Well, we're going to help you with that. Now, plants exist in all the environments. We've got our rainforest with all of its rich diversity, and plants are adapted to these almost perfect conditions for plant growth. But plants have obviously adapted to all the environments that exist. And we even have these vast expanses of coniferous forest that can withstand being completely icebound for 3-4 months out of the year, and they do just fine. Here in Central Florida, we have our own diversity. We have our own forests. We have our own plant communities that are perfectly adapted to the natural environments that are created by the non-living components of our world, the weather and the soil and our latitude and all these things that come together to create the conditions that are then favored by the particular plants that have taken up residence there. So here's a picture of some of our oak forest here at Brooker Creek Preserve with the live oak canopy and the palmetto understory. But we also have pine flatwood. See, these ecosystems are named after the plants that are there: the oak hammock, the pine flatwood, the hardwood swamp. So here we have a flooded forest, and these plants are adapted. They didn't just find themselves here and say, to heck with it, I'll grow here. These are plants with adaptations to living in a seasonally flooded forest. You can even see in the background, the trunks of the trees are swollen at the base to give them a little bit of balance, a wider stance, if you will, to give them a little bit better purchase on a saturated soil. Here at Brooker Creek Preserve, we have those upland and freshwater wetland systems. This is an aerial shot of our sister preserve, Weeden Island. And here the plant community is completely different. This is mangrove swamp. And so the plants that are living and thriving and perfectly adapted to living in a mangrove swamp are, of course, adapted to saline conditions. They can exclude salt from entering their tissues, or they can take the salt in and squirt it back out. All kind of fantastic adaptations to living in saline conditions. So again, we'll go back to a terrifying definition of what we're talking about: plants. Any of a kingdom of multicellular, eukaryotic, photosynthetic, lacking locomotive, and blah, blah, blah. Let's reword that. We're talking about living things, multicellular, that have the magic power of taking sunlight and atmospheric carbon dioxide and water, knocking all these things together to produce sugar and oxygen as a byproduct, which is pretty cool in my book, making them the center of a food web, the bottom of a food chain. However you want to look at this, plants are the producers. They take invisible substances and make them into three-dimensional objects, including their own cells. They can make from air and water and sunlight, they can make physical structures, three-dimensional objects. Not fungus. Fungus is the wrong branch of the tree of life. Plants branched off a long time ago, and as everything kind of adapted and made use of the world, the animals and the fungus kind of developed along the same branch. So we've got the animals and the fungus on one branch, the plants on another branch. So we got no fungus for you today. That's a separate lecture for a different day. Back to plants. What we're going to look at today, we're going to explore, what are we going to do with these 400,000 different kinds of plants? How are we going to break that 400,000 number down into nice, discrete, more easily understood groupings of plants? And then once we've looked at the big four, we'll find out what those big four have in common. What was it about that first organism that had all the characteristics that make a plant a plant. What were those characteristics of the original plant that eventually diversified into what we know today? And then we'll end up with just a taste of the fascinating world of plant hormones. Believe it or not, there are plant hormones. Basically answering the question, how does something that can't run away react to the environment? If it doesn't move, it can't run off, it can't go into a shell, it can't put a plaster on a wound. How do these beings react to the environment? And that can often be done through hormones. So we'll finish up with that. So what are we going to do with these 400,000? Well, we're going to classify them. We're going to put them into nice, easily studied, discrete bundles. And it's what humans do. We do this with everything. We sort things out. We put like with like. And putting like with like can be a subjective exercise. To you, you might sort things by color. Someone else might sort things by size. Someone else might sort things by what they're useful for. And those are perfectly acceptable ways of organizing information, organizing organisms, anything like that. And so we've classified plants and we've put them into useful bundles, like trees. Someone who studies trees is going to want to have that circumscription of the plant kingdom carved out for them, or they will carve it out for themselves, right? Vegetables are an important group of plants. They're economically important. They're nutritionally important. So that's a nice little collection, a nice little bag full of plants, the vegetables. Other economically important groups of plants might be invasive plants because they take a lot of money to get rid of, right? That's economically important. You pay someone and you use products that cost money to deal with invasive plants like weeds. Invasive plants are kind of like weeds on a bigger scale. And of course, just ornamental horticulture, an important, economically important circumscription of plants. We put flowers in our garden. And like I said, these are perfectly acceptable circumscriptions, but they're not scientific. And of the 400,000 different plants in the world, you would probably have that many different opinions about where to put an individual plant in a set of bundles like illustrated here. So the scientists, through studying evolutionary biology, have made some pretty tried and true divisions of plants. We have, for our intents and purposes, only 4. And I am sure that all of you can remember by the end, because I'm going to repeat this about 100 times, maybe 400,000 times, the 4 big groups. So when you look out the window, you don't even have to go outside. It might have gotten a little bit warmer. From the comfort of your home, you can look out the window and you can break every single plant out there into one of 4 groups. And from there, you can go on to learn more about that group and eventually that individual plant. The 4 big groups are the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants. These are scientific categorizations. The mosses represent modern species of some of the very first land plants. They have a very simple structure. They don't have any plumbing. They don't have any vascular tissue. Vascular and plumbing are the same thing. So they have no roots or stems or leaves because those tissues require the requisite plumbing. The mosses are just sitting on the ground, low to the ground, where osmosis can provide the water to go through their short little squatty bodies. And they reproduce by specialized cells, single cells that they release and hope against hope that that cell that they send into the environment will germinate and grow into the next generation. Those are the mosses. That's what defines moss. Moving up in a little bit of complexity, we have the ferns that have true roots, stems, leaves, but they've hung on to that very ancient way of sending one cell into the world at a time, hoping that that one cell will grow into an adult eventually. Becoming more specialized, especially in the reproductive process and not leaving quite so much to chance, we have the gymnosperms. They do have vascular systems like the ferns, root, stems, leaves, but they've got this wonderful invention, the seed, where an embryo is encased in a nice nutritious coating, and then that whole thing, that young plant, is sent out into the world to grow into the adult. And the ultimate in sophistication, if you will, the flowering plants, where all these processes, the reproductive process results in the seed, but the seed is encased in a structure called a fruit. And that fruit, in all its permutations, is the perfect vessel for getting offspring away into the world to find their fame and fortune. But they've got everything they need. They've got some food to take with them. They've got a mechanism to get them very far away from the parent plant so there won't be any competition. So the flowering plants are kind of the apex of plant evolution. Nothing against these quote unquote lower plants. The system worked millions of years ago. It's still working today. We still have mosses. We still have ferns. We still have gymnosperms and so on. So taking a closer look at these mosses, now, there are some things that you may have heard referred to moss. Moss is a word that is in the vernacular. We talk about moss growing on things. Normal people even talk about mosses growing here and there. But there might be a little bit of confusion and application of the word moss as it applies scientifically. Now remember, scientifically, a true moss is a plant with no roots, stems, leaves, and reproduces by spores. The stuff hanging in the trees that's referred to as hanging in the trees, that gray stuff hanging in the trees, is not moss. It's a flowering plant. It's at the far other end. True mosses, remember, have no vascular tissue. They reproduce by spores. They have to be very low growing, or they have to grow relatively close to the surface where they're attached, because they depend on that layer of water to have access to the water that they need, and to move their bits around that they need. I'll show you about that a little bit later, but this would be a nice example of a mossy habitat. It's damp, it's cool, it's humid, it's kind of shady. There's not a lot of worry about these tiny little plants drying out. But you have to hand it to these little things. I mean, here's moss for scale. This is what we're talking about, these itty bitty little individual plants that form these colonies. They still do that much better at not drying out than aquatic plants do. So the mosses represent the plants that came out of the water and managed to avoid becoming desiccated. They don't have roots, stems, or leaves, but they do have a little bit of waterproofing so they can survive on land. And they took advantage of the fact that nothing else had crawled out yet. And the mosses set the stage. And they grew where they could, and they reproduced where they could. And the system worked because they're still around today. Still very small because of that lack of vascular tissue. They can't move water over great distances, so they stay very small. Here's a pine needle for scale. And these plants are producing their reproductive structures. A long stalk with a little knob, little bulb on the end, and that bulb at the tip. So all these structures are growing out of an individual moss plant. And at the tip, we have this capsule that contains the spores. And spores are specialized cells, individual cells, that this plant that produced this structure is going to toss out a couple dozen of these spores, hoping against hope that one of these, it's only one cell, so it's going to drift in the wind, hoping that at least one is going to land somewhere where the conditions are just perfect for it to germinate and grow. The moss life cycle. You've got, here's that capsule. A little cap comes off and a little lid comes off. It's quite a complex little system, that capsule. And the spores kind of shake out like a salt shaker, pepper shaker. Again, it's just one cell. And they drift somewhere, and one spore is going to grow into this plant by cellular division. And this plant, these are not true leaves, remember, these are just scales, but it's photosynthetic. This little single plant here that grew from a spore is what's referred to as female. At the tip of this plant, there are some specialized cells that enclose the most important plant cell ever, the egg cell. Another spore is going to grow into, you guessed it, a male plant. That plant produces a capsule full of sperm cells. And with conditions being just perfect, with a layer of water washing over the surface of these adult plants once the spores have matured, a layer of water is going to wash over the surface of these adult plants. The sperm is released into the water and is going to swim and find its way down the neck of this structure, which happens to be called an archegonium, but you don't need to know that. The sperm is going to find the egg cell. We all know what happens when sperm meets egg. You end up with, botanically or early developmental biology, you end up with a zygote that becomes the embryo that is then going to grow into an adult. The adult, in this case, is represented by the stalk and the capsule. So literally we have two different plants in one. We have the plant that grew from a spore, right? This is a plant that grew from a spore. And the plants that grow from spores produce sperm cells or egg cells. And the egg cell then develops into another plant, an embryo of another plant. The sporophyte, the adult, that's going to then grow up, looking very different and still attached. It's going to grow up into being just a stalk and just a capsule to reproduce this whole thing. And that is this bizarre alternation of generations. We'll see it again in the ferns. But we can forget the mosses for now. That's it. That's really all you need to know. They're non-vascular. That's as big as they're going to get. They represent an ancient way of life that has survived to today. And they are one of four groups of plants today. Moving up in complexity, we have the ferns, and I bet a lot of you could identify ferns. I bet a lot of you have grown ferns. I bet a lot of you are growing ferns unintentionally, because we have quite a few native ferns that come up where you least expect them, and we even have some non-native, exotic, and invasive ferns whose success at reproduction in this part of Florida has meant that they kind of come up everywhere quite on their own. Technically speaking, all the ferns, which is a scientific grouping of plants, they do have vascular systems. So they do have real roots, they have real stems, and they have real leaves. But they've hung on to that weird reproductive method of using a single cell, throwing a single cell out into the environment, that single cell developing into a separate plant that then forms an embryo, the embryo becoming the adult plant. Now, this is the underside of a golden polypody or golden foot polypody. Golden because of the color of the scales on the stem, also golden because of the color of the structures underneath the leaf. And many folks know that if you turn a fern leaf, often referred to as a frond, if you take a fern leaf and flip it over, you might often see this pattern on the reverse. And many people would say those, holding it at maybe book's length, saying those are the spores, which is technically not wrong. But I'm going to teach you what's even more right. So we're looking at the underside of this fern frond, right? These are not bugs. These are not insects. This is not a disease. This is the fern undergoing its reproductive process. So on the underside of the fern leaf, we have these crazy dots. So the ferns have evolved leaves, and they have put their reproductive structures on their leaves. And ferns could look very ferny, or they could look like this. This is an adder's tongue fern, not looking as ferny as the others, with just the one kind of paddle-shaped leaf here, and then another leaf that's more modified to have those reproductive structures on. More diversity in ferns, the bird's nest fern. Probably not what you would draw if you were asked to draw a fern, but because it has vascular tissue, it has real roots, stems, leaves, and reproduces by spores, that informs the scientific community that this individual organism belongs within the group of plants that are known as ferns. You might grow the Staghorn Fern. This is another plant that has modified leaves, in this case, modified for life attached to the trunk of a tree, with one set of leaves that are flat and adhesive. They can actually adhere to the trunk of a tree. And then they have the other leaves that kind of stick out into the air, and those leaves are the ones that release the spores, those crazy single cells that are going to grow into another plant. So we have sterile and fertile leaves on this fern. But going back to our original, our golden foot polypody, looking a little bit more fern-like than the previous examples, that is not a spore. It is a reproductive structure, and it does have something to do with spores. But let's zoom in on this one structure that's being circled here. What we see if we zoom in on that is a little island on the backside of a leaf, and each island is made up of these spherical structures with a zipper. So you can see the structure that's being circled here is repeated over and over and over again. Excuse me, you can even see, if you look down some kind of unripened structures that have yet to develop and turn brown and unzip. These structures are called sporangia, like gymnasia. Sporangia, it's where the spores come from. It's the housing for the spores. So the spores are actually inside the sporangia. Spores, remember, they're just one cell. So on the back of this fern frond, we have this dot. If we zoom in on the dot, you can see that it's a cluster of these smaller structures called sporangia. And if we take one sporangium, here's a side view of that one sporangium with the zipper just along here. You can now see the individual spores inside that structure. So incredibly small spores are, incredibly small, microscopic. They're one single specialized cell. And depending on the species, depending on the group, even within the ferns, you can break them down into nice discrete bundles. They're all still ferns, but some are more related to themselves than others. Inside that sporangia, there might be 24 or 36 consistently inside one sporangium. There could be 24 or 36 individual spores. So when conditions are right, the sporangium, singular, will open. That zipper will kind of unzip. It doesn't really unzip, it kind of pops open. It's kind of an explosive event. There's two of these cells side by side, maybe this one and this one, that are very weakly linked together, and they'll actually release. And this part is under a little bit of tension, so it pulls the sporangium open, releasing the spores inside. And things get really weird once the spores are released. You can watch this happen. You can take a 10x magnifying glass up to a fern frond, shine a bright light on it so you can see what you're doing, and the bright light's going to dry things out a little bit, and you can watch these little things just poop, pop open and cough out the spores. So here we have a drawing of one of those spores being released. I don't think it actually does a corkscrew spin, but I thought that was quite fun as an illustration. Let's assume that it does. It gets caught in a little eddy of breeze and gets flown over there. That spore, just like our moss spores, is going to germinate and grow and divide. It's a single cell, so it's going to begin to divide, and it becomes exponentially larger and larger, and the cells differentiate and they form their own plant. So the spore lands, germinates, divides, differentiates into a separate plant, a little heart-shaped plant. And that heart-shaped plant contains the analogous structures to the moss. They have the little sperm-bearing structures and little egg-bearing structures. And with water and time, the sperm is going to swim over to the egg-bearing structure and literally swim. They have little tails. They're going to swim down the archegonium and find that egg cell and fertilize the egg cell, resulting in, remember, a zygote, embryo, brand new plant, brand new embryo, union of egg and cell is a new individual, right? This new individual then grows and becomes the adult that we can see. Most of this other stuff happens out of sight on a very small scale. But then we get the grown-up fern, produces the sporangia on the underside of the leaf. Sporangia ripen, release the spores, and there we go again. It's called an alternation of generations. There's two generations. There's the spore producing generation that we can see. And then there's this gamete, the egg and sperm plant. So two different plants. And here's that gametophyte. This is what spores grow into. Spores don't grow into ferns. Spores grow into these things. These things, these prothali, these gametophytes, they produce eggs and sperms. And once the eggs and sperms get together, that embryo grows into the fern. You can see these, you can find these. They like, well, wherever you see a fern growing, this probably happened. So it's not 100% by chance, right? It actually is effective and efficient, and it does work. But of course, spores need to be produced by the billions for one to reach maturity. You can actually grow prothali if you can collect the spores off a mature plant and put them in some damp soil, keep a lid on it so it's nice and humid. Eventually, the little gametophytes are going to grow. And if a sperm meets an egg in the archegonium of this gametophyte, that embryo will then begin to grow out of the gametophyte. And here comes the next sporophyte generation. Those are the ferns. That's how the ferns work. Pretty crazy, I know. Is everyone all right? I'm going to insist that we all take a little 2-minute break. Look away from the screen, look down, think about a question, put your question in Q&A, get a drink of water. Hold on. There. We'll take 2 minutes for a little bit of a breather and process what we just thought about. How about that? And I'll have a look at the Q&A. Angela got in very early. What's a good place locally to study plants? Excellent question. And is there an app that I recommend for identifying plants? Plants, because they don't run away, you can study them anywhere they grow. Any park or parking lot. Always consider botanical gardens. You've got the opportunity at botanical gardens to have plants labeled, and you can get a lot of information about the label. Its common name, its scientific name, which can be very descriptive. What family of plants it belongs to is often there. If you're interested in cultivating plants, sometimes the cultivation notes are included on the label. So botanic gardens, there's one at the University of South Florida. There's a botanical garden in Largo. But otherwise, a good field guide and a public park are good places to go. As long as you remember the rules, that you don't collect things, you don't pick things unless you've got permission, that sort of thing. And as far as an app, Inaturalist. Perhaps we could put a link to Inaturalist. There are a lot of plant identification apps and services, but we prefer Inaturalist because Inaturalist is citizen science. By using the app, you add to the knowledge that application contains. You make a contribution. And Inaturalist doesn't just give you a suggestion. It gives you a suggestion, and then you need to double check. And if you make a claim like, I saw a ivory-billed woodpecker, and you put your picture up because that's what was suggested, you'll have 10 people come in they're gonna see that post, and they're gonna say, actually what you saw was and you'll get agreement, you'll get consensus of what it actually was. And by being incorrect in your assessment, you nonetheless have contributed to the scientific discourse, and you've added a photograph of an individual organism that was then identified by experts as what it's claimed to be. So Inaturalist is the one that we use. Now, how many sporangia in one of those things? Let's see if we can back up. I'm not sure if do I still have controls? An excellent question. We're sitting here looking at this spot on the back of a fern frond. The spot has a name. It's called a sorus, S-O-R-U-S. A collection of these things are called sori. And how many sporangia are going to be found in one particular spot? It could depend on the species, or it could be indeterminate. This particular sorus that we've zoomed in on here is continually producing these sporangia, and it could feasibly continue producing sporangia until the leaf is severed from the plant. So it could be a finite number, it could be an indefinite number, just based on the amount of time that the plant is going to live. That could be a distinguishing characteristic for a particular species. It's very likely that some ferns only produce X number and no more. So I'm sorry, there's not an easy answer to your question. It could be some, it could be all, many, infinite. I hope that's a good enough answer, Wendy. Thank you for the question. Rebekah has an interesting question. Rebekah actually brings up a little bit of a fib that I've been kind of stitching through this presentation, that there's only 4 different kinds of plants. There's more. There are nuances. But for those of us who just want to leisurely study the plant world, there's basically these 4. Now there's another group that are called the liverworts and the lycophytes. There's others, but they're kind of at the tail end of their experiment of living on Earth, whereas these 4 that we're studying today have become dominant today. There are other groups that have been experimenting and are kind of fizzling out, including some plants that are called liverworts, and they are very similar. They look very similar to this gametophyte, this fern gametophyte. And how would you tell the difference? How would you know? Well, the gametophytes, the fern gametophytes, are individuals, whereas the liverworts are branching plants. So you would see a structure like this, looking very similar, constructed very similarly, but it would be continually growing. The gametophyte is a finite individual plant. It gets to be a certain size and it stops growing, whereas the liverwort continues to grow. So you would find great mats of liverwort, whereas you would find individual gametophytes here and there. Jay wants to know if plants sleep at night and if does photosynthesis stop at night? 2 excellent questions. Photosynthesis does not stop at night. Some plants actually will wait until nighttime, desert plants in particular, but not exclusively, wait until nighttime to open their doors to the air. They don't even, you know how plants take in carbon dioxide? We'll get to that later. Desert plants, they don't want to open the doors because they're going to dehydrate. So they wait until the sun goes down to open their doors, And that's when they collect up their carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So they have to perform certain functions overnight so they can close shop up during the day. I hope Sylvia's comment that the process is so complicated, I hope we're explaining it. Even though it's complicated, I hope that we're getting some clarity for you, and thanks for joining us. All right, I hope we all got a drink, got to stretch your eyes. We'll carry on, and we'll move on to number 3, the gymnosperms. The conifers, they're often referred to. Roots, stems, leaves, and they've got this wonderful invitation. They've got this wonderful invention, the seed. So we're going to leave the chance of spores behind and make an investment into the next generation by sending an embryo into the world almost fully formed with a lunchbox to take with it, away from the parent plants for lack of competition, and hopes for the best. The gymnosperms. So these arrived on scene, and their efficiency and their ability to get very tall gave them an extra presence on land. So we had the mosses kind of setting the stage, and then the ferns came in and they started getting better at things, and they were looking out for themselves, and then along come the conifers, and they figured out wood and trunks and bark. So they got big and everything changed. Forests of conifers, coniferous forests became dominant land vegetation. But not all gymnosperms are conifers. The biggest living thing ever in the history of anything was a conifer. Like giant redwood is a conifer, right? It's a gymnosperm. Look, it's even bigger than a mountain. They're huge. But there are weird remnant conifer experiments. I mean, conifers differentiated, experimented. We have conifers out in the deserts of Namibia that are basically just 2 long leaves that get longer and longer, like your hair, if you have it, longer and longer, and the desert winds break the ends off and they just keep growing longer. And occasionally they'll produce these cones, hoping against hope that someday there will be conditions that will be right for the seeds that are contained within these cones to grow into another one of these weird things. This is Welwitschia. Conifers are also represented by the cycads. Cycads are an old experiment in land plants. A lot of people think these are palms because they have the trunk and the crown, but they're not. They're conifers. They're ancient. These are known in the fossil record. A lot of cycads are still dependent on insects for pollination, because insects were around when conifers first arrived, and they tried to form some sort of agreement, the insects and the conifers, but didn't really work out. So the conifers kind of stuck with being wind pollinated, and the insects eventually had a much better relationship with the flowering plants once they arrived. But a lot of cycads still need some insects. They need some of those early evolving insects like beetles that are still around and have been around to visit their male and female cones. The female cones, of course, being the structures that produce these wonderful things called seeds. Most of us know conifers and evergreens from the more familial familiar temperate landscape conifers, or landscape evergreens, they're often called, the Christmas trees, right? So we know them, we know they're represented, but let's take a look at how they work. I mean, we peeked under the skirt of the mosses and the ferns, so let's just see what's going on with these gymnosperms. They produce these structures called cones, or strobili, strobe meaning a repeating pattern. And we've given, again, male and female to the two different gametophyte types. So we have what are referred to as the male cones and the female cones. The male cones, of course, being where pollen is produced. So a pollen grain is kind of all that's left of that gametophyte that was a separate plant in the mosses and was a separate plant in the ferns. That's all been not simplified, but streamlined, specialized, and now the gametophyte is just represented by the little pollen grain contained within a male cone. Now you might have seen these. They're temporary. The male cones are temporary. They have one job to do: produce pollen, release it. Okay, that's two jobs: produce pollen and release it. And then they're done. They're dropped off the tree. They're not green. They don't photosynthesize. They're empty of pollen. They're just jettisoned. And you can see these are the male cones. Their job is done, so they fall into the ground. You can see where the individual scales of the cone have broken off here. So you can actually see these scales. Let's zoom in on one of these scales. Here's one of those scales in cross section. And what it's full of are the pollen grains. All that's left of an entire gametophyte in one special pollen grain with a couple of nucleus. It's like one cell with several nuclei, and two wings. There's a wing there. There's a wing there. Here's that cell that's full of nuclei. The wings are to get airborne. So when the pollen is ripened, the male cone, each one of these little scales is going to open up and release all these guys out into the world. We all know what happens next. When the conifers are releasing their pollen, it goes everywhere. The wind is the pollinator. The wind takes the pollen from the male cones into the breeze and over to another tree of the same species, which is producing the female cones. And the female cones are small and sticky. Sticky because they have to grab pollen out of the air. They even have special little droplets of sap that can get covered in pollen. They're very sticky, little sticky sap droplets that they can then suck back in, pulling the pollen inside the cone. Once inside the cone, the female cone, let's back up. So here we have the female cone, and we're going to look at each one of these scales. And each one of these scales contains an egg cell within this structure, way down in here. So the pollen is going to land, the pollen is going to land, and it's going to grow down this hollow tube, and it's going to grow through all this tissue until it finds the one special egg cell to fertilize, to grow into the embryo. And for 3 years, that female cone is going to sit developing that embryo and that seed, providing that embryo and that seed with nutrition, get the embryo nice and well developed, get the seed nice and full of carbohydrates for the road. It's going to differentiate some cells into a long wing, and eventually from each one of the scales of the female pine cone, after 3 years, the scales are going to peel back and the seeds are going to slip off. The seeds are going to slip off and they'll fly away. They're naked. They're just seeds. These are seeds that have been these are seeds with a piece of, what is that? Not fiber. What am I trying to say? Tissue. I don't know. Anyway, wings stuck to the seed. The dispersal mechanism is the wind, just like with the pollen. Forget the insects, forget the animals. Let's just send the children off on little whirligigs. That's the conifers. Seed lands, grows, seed germinates. The embryo, the fully formed embryo, the baby tree is inside the seed. And if that seed lands someplace good, it's going to germinate, and here comes a new tree. It's not a different plant like we had in the mosses and the ferns. What the seed germinates into is going to be just a baby version of the plant that released the seeds. And the circle's unbroken. I'm going to let y'all go again. Let's take another 2 minutes for a bio break. I imagine we've been at this for an hour. We should be at the half-hour mark. So I imagine we need to stand up again. So again, okay, stop talking. Let the people go for 1 minute. All right, time's up. We're halfway there. Hope everyone's doing okay. We'll pick it up and move on to the big one, the major. Of the 400,000 different kinds of plants that have been described out there, about 300,000 of them are flowering plants. So you can look out your window, you can rule out mosses because you probably can't see them from your window. You can rule out ferns if you're not obviously looking at a fern. You are probably fully aware of the 2 or 3 or 4 different native species of conifer, of Gymnosperm, and a couple others like Kunti, a popular native plant. Everything else is a flowering plant. Believe it or not, the oak trees, the grasses, the palms, everything, the weeds, the forbs, the Spanish moss, flowering plants. So the majority of the plants that we have are the flowering plants. The magic of flowering plants is that they put their seeds inside of a fruit. Yes, all flowering plants produce fruit. Fruit. Botanically speaking, not nutritionally speaking, not cookbook speaking, botanically speaking, fruit is the ripened ovary of a flowering plant containing fertilized eggs, which are the seeds. Remember when our egg cell got fertilized on the cone? We're still fertilizing eggs. We're still making seeds. But in flowering plants, we're putting those seeds inside of a fruit. Whether you can eat it or not doesn't matter. It's called a fruit. A ripened ovary is called a fruit. And that fruit facilitates the dispersal of that seed. Remember how the conifers depend on the wind? The flowering plants have been around more or less alongside the animals. And so many flowering plants have kind of engaged the animals as a means of dispersing their seeds by way of fruit. But there's some tricks. There's some tricks with fruits. So a very basic flowering plant layout, a very basic flowering plant blueprint would be petals, stamens, pistil. The petals attract the pollinator. Here comes the pollinator. The pollinator is there for the nectar, the reward. So the flower has to have petals to attract the pollinator, nectar, it has to produce the sugar water that does no benefit to the plant whatsoever. It has to produce this sugar water, this nectar, as a reward to entice this insect to come to the flower. Once the insect, in this case the bee, is at the flower, taking that nectar reward, the plant is going to sneak or force or hide pollen onto that insect so that when that insect then goes to another flower looking for a new reward, the pollen is going to be transferred. So it's a little bit of trickery, and it can get quite insidious. There are a lot of tricks that plants play on their pollinators, and there are a lot of insects that outwit the plant's tricks and can actually outwit the system, sneak around the backside of the flower, steal the nectar, not get covered in that dirty pollen. It's all going on out there. But basically speaking, here we have a pretty typical flower layout. You have the petals that are attracting the pollinator, the pollen in between the pollinator and the reward, so the pollinator has to get covered in the stuff. And the payoff, the pollinator gets the nectar reward, the plant then forces the insect to transfer that pollen when it visits a flower of the same species. This is how the flowering plant's flowers are put together. This is basics. This is basic flower anatomy, a side view where you've got the little modified leaves that form the flower bud. Once the flower is ready, the bud peels back. The petals, this next layer, also peel back. The little pollen-bearing structures are then exposed to the environment and pollinators. And the most essential part in the middle, this organ called the pistil. And the pistil includes an organ called an ovary, and that might be familiar to you with the eggs inside the ovary. Basic flower structure. Now, those parts, those basic flower parts that are the same across all flowering plants, can be different shapes and sizes, a myriad, a world of different shapes and sizes, but they're the same parts in the same order. Here we have the flower of one of our native bromeliads, and we have the petals not flared open, but rather configured into a tubular structure, and the stamens are all, the pollen-bearing structures are all crowded together. This is to facilitate pollination by a long-beaked nectar customer. So the nectar customer in this case would be a hummingbird. And the hummingbird has to get past the pollen-bearing structures to get to the nectar. So the plant just covers its little hummingbird head with pollen, so that when this bird goes to another matching flower, it's going to transfer that pollen. So it's the same structures, it's the same idea, but flowers have diversified into this fantastic myriad of shapes and configurations to facilitate their own pollination needs. Some flowering plants don't make petals. Some don't want to put the investment into petals and nectar and all that nonsense when wind works just fine for the conifers. Why can't it work for these flowering plants? We all know the oaks are quite good at putting their pollen into the air. They do it every spring. And the male flowers, the flowers that bear the male structures, the pollen-bearing structures, just like the conifers, these flowers fall off. The female oak flowers, of course, with no petals, no nectar, because they've caught pollen out of the air. They're still flowers. They've caught pollen out of the air, just like their ancestors. They pull pollen out of the air, and that ovary, that special floral organ, the ovary, hangs out on the tree and develops into the fruit of an oak tree. Remember, I said botanically it's fruit whether you can eat it or not. It's a ripened ovary, it's fruit. If it's going to kill you, it's still fruit. It's a ripened ovary with one or more seeds inside. Technically, it's fruit. We might all have seen this. Literally the birds and bees, where we have a bird or a bee pollinating the flower. The bits that aren't needed fall off. The petals don't need them anymore. They've attracted the pollinator. Pollination has happened. The anthers, the pollen-bearing structures, they've done their thing. They can go. Not supporting them anymore, but the ovary stays. The ovary stays attached to the plant and grows and grows and grows. See, into a fruit. You can even still, you can identify different floral structures on a ripened fruit. In the case of a tomato, it still has the little specialized leaves that form the bud. They stay around. And you can see the little structure, this little stigma and style where the pollen is received. It often is still stuck to the overly engorged and swollen ovary that contains the seeds that will be the next generation. Peanuts, they've got seeds inside. They're a fruit. This is science. This is not a cooking class. This is a ripened ovary with fertilized eggs, which have developed into seeds. Ripened ovary with seeds inside equals fruit. Peanuts are fruit. So the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, the flowering plants. See how easy that is? See all the botany that you already knew? So let's take all these groups backwards. Where did they come from? What made plants plants? Where did this all start? Well, what they have in common are their plant cells, featuring this special thing called a cell wall, really special thing called a chloroplast, and an area of, it's called a vacuole, although it's not empty, but it's an area within the cell whose size and shape can change, called a vacuole. But the cell wall is made of a very, very, very special carbohydrate. They're called cells, and animal cells are called cells as well. The term cell, as it is applied to living organism tissues, tissues being made of cells, cell was applied to these structures because of someone looking at plant cells under the microscope. They looked under a microscope at plant tissue and they saw something like this and they thought to themselves, those look like the cells that nuns live in. I'm going to call them cells. And that's how we get the word cell as it applies biologically, named after the chambers that for some reason people thought they needed to live in to be super religious. Cells. The plant cell wall is made of cellulose, a very complex polysaccharide carbohydrate that has some fantastic properties. Cellulose is tough, it's waterproof, it's what gives plants their stature. It allows them to grow upright and present their solar collectors to the sun. Cellulose is also present in the dispersal mechanism for cotton. The fibers of cellulose help disperse the cotton seeds, and of course we've taken advantage of that. Cotton's not the only cellulosic fiber that we've taken advantage of. Cellulose led us to papyrus, which led us to paper, which led us to books and the printing press. Made us smart. Plants made us smart. If it weren't for cellulose, we wouldn't be this smart. If it weren't for plants, right? The central vacuole is this empty space where water can be shunted in times of plenty and stored, making the plant a nice turgid plant, making the cells very turgid, making everything very taut and upright. And in lean times, it's a reservoir of water that might be used up if it's not available from the environment. Plants can use the water that they have in reserve in these vacuoles to keep the living processes going, but eventually using up that using up their water balloons are going to shrink, and so is the plant. So that's kind of how plants can wilt and come back. The chloroplast is a fascinating structure. The chloroplast is where the chlorophyll is found. And because the chloroplast is where the chlorophyll is found, it's the chloroplast where photosynthesis takes place. Photosynthesis means taking light and making sugar, synthesizing sugar from photons, from light. And if you look at a chloroplast, if we take one chloroplast out of a plant cell, it's got these distinguishing characteristics. It's got its own DNA. It's a thing living inside of a cell that has its own unique DNA. And it has these hamburgers. I'm afraid that's what they were called when I was learning botany, and I've never forgotten. The thylakoids look like stacks of green hamburgers. That's just anyway. It's got these things. The chloroplast has its own DNA, and it's got these membranes, these membrane-bound structures that are shockingly similar to the composition of photosynthetic bacteria. There are free-living photosynthetic bacteria, bacteria being the earliest branch on the tree of life. We're up here studying plants, way up here. But how did plants become photosynthetic? They took photosynthetic bacteria and forced them into servitude inside their cells, and they have lived there ever since, and they reproduce themselves. They have their own DNA. It's endosymbiosis. That's a blue-green algae cell. Here's a colony of cyanobacteria. We've got a whole episode on the algae. Please check out our YouTube channel. There it is. What is algae? We released it 2 or 3 weeks ago now. All of our videos are recorded there. So what happens in the chloroplast? Back to plants. I just wanted to show you the origin of the chloroplast, blue-green algae. But now we're back inside of a plant. Here's one chloroplast. The scary Krebs citric acid cycle and the Calvin cycle and the ATP and the adenosine triphosphate and everything that turns people off of botany. Here it is in a little graphic happening. And let's just focus on the biggies, the water, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, and the sugar, the good stuff. In the presence of sunlight, here, plants here can take water and carbon dioxide, represented here by some fizzy water, carbonated water. Get it? Sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. Plants can turn that into oxygen and sugar. Here's the best thing in the world. Plants are doing us the best favor ever by taking these innocuous raw materials and making us, they're not making it for us, they're making it for themselves. But the fact that plants can synthesize, they're the ultimate synthesizers. They make the stuff that is the basis of the center of every food web, except what happens in the middle, in the depths of the ocean and the hydrothermal vents. That's another episode. Thus, we have the diversity of plant life on Earth. That's what's happening. So what are the major groups? Mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and flowering plants. What do they all have in common? These crazy cell structures made of cellulose. The cells are made of cellulose, which has many applications beyond what the plant intends them for. That central vacuole that's unique to plant cells. And the chloroplast, the endosymbiotic blue-green algae. It's no longer bacteria, but it is clearly derived from endosymbiotic bacteria. So let's finish up with how can these organisms that are stuck to the ground, how are they able to respond to the environment long enough to reproduce? That's the whole point. Make your food, reproduce. You've got to do that at least once, or your life is not worth living. No. How do plants respond to the environment? The only thing they've got are hormones to respond. And there are a fascinating variety, diversity, and number of different plant hormones that have very direct and oftentimes very specific functions that they play in plant development and in plant response to stimuli. We've all certainly abused houseplants to the point where they don't have enough light and they bend towards the light. This growth is a hormonally driven response to insufficient light. So plants, they depend on the sunlight. Remember, they need that sunlight to take the carbonated water and turn it into sugar. And so in the absence of enough, the plants have to bend. But these plants aren't muscularly moving. There's a hormone at work that is causing the cells on this side of the stem, even these little seedling stems, causing the cells on this side, the side that's away from the light, to lengthen, and the cells on this side of the stem to contract or not get as big, which results in a curvature of the entire individual. That's hormone driven. This plant isn't actively moving. That movement is driven by signals being provided to the cells on how to grow or not grow, how to elongate or not elongate. Here's a plant where the ground dropped out from underneath it when it was a very, very young little sapling. Hormones responded to a gravitational stimulus and informed cellular growth throughout the plant to elongate on one side and stay small on another side, so that as this tree grew, it appears as though it's righting itself. It's just growing in that direction. You see what I mean? Now, a full-grown tree might not have enough life in it, might not have enough plasticity to right itself up like this. This obviously happened very early in this plant's life, and it has, over the years, begun the process of uprighting itself. But still, it's due to the action of hormones. Just two examples of the jillions of applications that hormones have in plant development. Reproduction. I mean, when should a flower open? What environmental signals are going to have to be just right for the flower to open? So once the environmental signals have been detected by the plant, how does the plant signal to its flower buds that it's time to open, all at the same time, so that the pollen is available to the pollinators to move to the other plant to get the pollination going? Hormones synchronizing this process. The sequential fruit ripening also has to happen in a particular way. You don't want it to be too fast or too slow. It has to be just right, hormone driven. The speed at which tissues develop, grow, divide, die, hormones decide when it's time to break down all that chlorophyll and turn into the pretty autumn leaves, and then eventually fall from the tree completely. The formation of novel organs at particular times of year. It's time to make potatoes, so the hormones say to the potato plant. We've been growing all summer. It's about to get cold, or it's about to get really dry. Switch from growing into putting all that carbohydrate into a storage organ. These kinds of processes are hormone driven. The fact that we have these chemical substances complex chemical substances that appear in various branches of the tree of life and have these crazy effects on us and on all living creatures really does kind of underscore what might be obvious to lots of people, that we're all just organisms at the end of the day. Even those of us that can study organisms, we're one of them. We're an organism of many, under the same influences, under the same pressures, and driven by a lot of the same processes. Hormones, plant hormones, can even tell a plant to do something it's not meant to do. So, in an area of a stem that, for all intents and purposes, is supposed to produce leaves for photosynthesis, hormones can say, nope, we're not in that business anymore. We got to switch tactic. It's time to put some roots. I know we're in the air, but we need to make some roots up here right now because something's happening that's going to require roots. So it just blows, it can very easily blow your mind, the complexity. And it's almost as though, it appears as though, the plant is knowing what it needs and responding. These are all down to these complex environmental cues as manifest by the activity of plant hormones. Certain insects have actually figured out how to synthesize artificial plant hormones to stimulate plants by introducing these artificial plant hormones to get the plant to grow tissues that benefit the insect. Has no benefit to the plant whatsoever. No harm, but no benefit whatsoever. The wasps, certain species of wasps, they use their stinger. Their venom is modified. Instead of something to hurt or defend themselves, it's modified into a substance that mimics plant hormone. So the wasp will sting the plant, sting, quote unquote. They'll inoculate the plant with this growth hormone mimic modified venom. And the plant starts to grow this wart, this growth, this mass, this spongy mass of tissue that we call a gall. That spongy tissue is just perfect to feed the little wasp baby. So the gall wasps have figured out how to mimic plant hormones. They can introduce the mimic hormone and an egg into plant tissue, and then the plant goes and raises its child. Cunning. Okay, I've gone a half an hour over. Really, really appreciate your attention, especially with this extra time that you've spent. Botanical Science for Beginners, obviously just scratching the surface. Hope you enjoyed today's presentation. There's so much more to learn. Again, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I don't think I have a poll for you today. Lucky day, there's no poll for you today. I see we're having a couple of Q&As coming in, so I'll go ahead and open that.
And we do have a poll.
We do have a poll. It's not your lucky day. Not only have you been kept for a half an hour or more, we have a quick series of questions for you while I have a drink of water. And thank you for your response. Thanks for answering. Just a few simple questions. As part of University of Florida, of course, we're always polling, getting data. The data is never assigned to an individual. I guess UF hasn't figured out how to make money on selling people's identities, so we don't. I know that sounds really wrong, but anyway, crass. Anyway, your identity is safe with us. We're just collecting raw data. I have to plug, if you want to learn more about the differences between some commonly confused species, Lara and I have put together a field guide called This or That. It's available from the IFAS bookstore, ifasbooks.ifas.ufl.edu. Unfortunately, not available from any of the other booksellers online, just through IFAS Books. You can always phone Extension Service. They can help you find IFAS Books. It's an easy field guide, commonly confused species. If you do think of any questions, any comments, any concerns, any complaints, anything that we can use to make our presentations better, never hesitate to reach out. I thank you for your attention today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks for joining us.